Hi, I'm Glyn Dewis and I'm a photographer and author from the UK, and I just wanted to take a moment to dive in to let you know about one of the classes I've got recorded for the Photoshop Summit, or the Photoshop Virtual Summit, coming up in November. Now, if you're anything like me, when you're using Photoshop, you like to use it for all the fun, creative stuff, as opposed to all the mundane, repetitive tasks. So for example, one of the sessions I've got within a class I've called the Photoshop Power Session is all about preparing your images for Facebook. How to make them look their very, very best, because we all know that Facebook can completely batter them before we get them online. So in the session, part of it builds up to where I kind of go through the settings that I use, and part of those settings are where we have to get the longest edge of our images to be 2048 pixels. That's one of the things we do to make them look absolutely bang on Facebook. The trouble is, Photoshop doesn't know whether your image is landscape or portrait orientated, or maybe even square. And it's got to make the longest edge 2048 pixels. So to do that, we use something called a conditional action, and I explain all about that. But one of the things I also do is talk about droplets, an incredibly fast way that we can get Photoshop to make its own mind up what the image is, whether it's landscape or portrait, and then be able to process it to do everything it needs to do to make your images look great for Facebook. And you could do that for one image, 10 images, 100 images, or thousands of images, and it'll do it all automatically for you. And like I say, that's using something called droplets. All right, so now that we've got all our actions set up, we've got the Facebook wide, the Facebook tool, and also the Facebook settings where we have a conditional action so that Photoshop can decide what to do depending on whether the image is landscape or portrait orientated. Now the problem here is what we don't want to do is to have to click on this action again and again if we have a folder of images that we want to process. We can actually use something called batch. Now if I go to the file menu and then we choose automate, here is the batch option, and this is where we can kind of set Photoshop up to choose actions from our set. We can get it to choose the action that we want, and then we can say this here is the folder of images that we want to process, be it 1, 10, 100, 1,000 or thousands and thousands of images. We can tell it to choose that folder there. These little checkboxes here are if we have any kind of stoppages within our actions, we can override those by putting ticks in the necessary one. We don't have an issue with those at all. Over here is where we can choose, once you've processed them, this is where to save them. And you can see I've already got this one set up to save in the social folder. We also have the override action save as commands. We put a tick in there, and then we can use these little areas here to rename the file once it's processed it. And then we would click OK. The trouble is we need to do that every single time. The other problem is that Photoshop remembers the previous settings that you had. So let's just say now that we've already got our Facebook export already set up in the batch. We then go and create another batch for another set of actions. If we then want to use the Facebook batch, we've got to recreate it all over again. And that kind of defeats the object of making things quick and automated. A better way to do it is using droplets. So this is what we do. We go to File, Automate, Create Droplet. And when we do this, you'll see that this large dialog box comes up here, pretty similar to the batch one. So first of all, we'll choose where we want the droplet to be saved. So we'll go Choose, and we'll save it onto the desktop. And you can see here, I've already named this one Facebook Settings, and .app is the actual extension for this droplet icon. We'll click on Save. We then say that this droplet is going to use a specific action, and that action is found in My Set, and the one we're going to use is the one called Facebook Settings. We don't need to put any tick in these checkboxes here. We then say once you've processed them, this is where I want you to save them out in the desktop social folder. We'll override the Save As command, and then we're going to rename them. So you can see here I've got the document name followed by _FB for Facebook, and then the extension. So that'll be my file _fb.gif.png.jpg, and then we'll click OK. So now if we minimize Photoshop so we can see the desktop, here we have our icon. This is our droplet, And all I would need to do, if I had a single image, I could click and drag it on top of the icon and it'll process it and save it into the social folder. Or I could have a folder of images like I have here, different orientations. So we've got tool, we've got square, we've got landscape. I could drag those on top of the icon. It'll then process them and save them in the social folder, which you can see at the moment is completely empty. So let's give it a go. Let's get these images here, drag the icon on top of the droplet and then let go. So Photoshop has now processed all those images. So let's just minimize it. We'll then go back to the desktop and now look in what was an empty social folder. Now we can see there's a load of different images in there. So let's have a quick look to see how they've been resized. For example, the Dewis 3 one here, if we right click and get info, the long edge should be 2048 pixels, which we can see here, 2048. We've got this portrait orientated picture here. Get the information on that one. So right click, get info. Again, we can see the tool edge, the height is 2048. And we also have a square image here, a 1:1 crop. Let's get the get info. We can see here 2048 by 2048, all resized perfectly. And to be completely transparent, let's have a quick look in the original images that we dragged on top of the icon, just to show what size they were. If I right click on that one, say get info, we can see now that the actual size of it was 7515 by 4600. So that droplet has successfully resized all those images and got them ready for me to upload onto Facebook by placing them into the social folder. A massive, massive time saver. So for more of this kind of content, you can check out my Photoshop Power Session at the Virtual Summit. There's loads of other things I can teach you to get the most out of Photoshop and really, really quickly. Brand new stuff that I've never recorded before. But there's also a class I've got called the Photoshop Lighting Effects. And there's classes, 2 classes by each of the other 19 instructors. So you're talking around about sort of 40 hours worth of instruction. So I've put a link in the description below to the Photoshop Virtual Summit. It starts on November the 9th, running through to the 13th. Check it out. It's free Photoshop training. All right, so Dave then, tell us, what is the Photoshop Virtual Summit?
Well, if you imagine any kind of, in the past, when we used to go to a convention or a conference where you would see a whole group of instructors teaching classes at different times in different rooms, it's kind of that, but all virtual. So it's a collection of 20 top Photoshop instructors, each teaching a couple of classes spread out over a 5-day period. So there's a total of 40 classes and at least, well, probably over 30 hours of Photoshop instruction, and it's free to watch. Well, I got to say it was both easy and really difficult, because it was easy to put down my wish list of who are the top instructors that I would love to be on this team, because in part I've watched them and I've learned from them over the years, but also I know them as just good people. And I thought that was equally important, because I've always felt that if someone is just a good giving person, then that's going to naturally make them a good instructor. So the easy part was putting down a list. The hard part was, I think I got to about 28 pretty quickly. So then it was like, oh no, now I have to see, and honestly, except for I think maybe 1 or 2 people that just were totally slammed with other projects, every single person that I ended up asking said, oh yeah, I'm in. How do I start? And as you remember, that first one all happened pretty darn fast. So if they just go to the main website, and I'm sure you'll have a link for them, there's a button that you click to sign up for the free pass. And the way that it works, and this is just the way that our system is set up so we can keep track of everybody and make sure that everyone's being informed. Each day, the morning of the summit, you'll get an email, which is a link to that day's classes. And each hour on the hour, Eastern Standard Time, although I'll talk more about that in a second, a new class is released. and that day's worth of classes is available to watch for free for 48 hours. At that time, once that 48-hour period is done, then the day's classes are moved into kind of an archived member area, and that's where the VIP pass comes in. Now, as far as the time zone, one thing to address is the classes are not broadcast live. They're just released at a certain time. And I say that because I get a lot of response from people saying, well, that's going to be the middle of the night in where I live. I don't want to miss it. There's really nothing to be gained by watching at the time it's released because it's not live. You won't miss anything by tuning in later. So that's why they're available for 48 hours. And that's all included in the free ticket. And then the VIP pass is an optional choice we've given people who want either are worried that they'll miss some classes or they just want the option to rewatch the classes. And that VIP pass gives you lifetime access to watch all the classes, plus some additional things like any session notes that are provided by the instructors, downloadable practice files and things like that. I didn't want it to be kind of a sit back and watch event, because while that's useful to me, most people I think would agree that the way you really gain new knowledge is by putting it into practice. So by having the combination of the ability to rewatch the class, downloadable files so you can kind of follow along and or practice, and notes that accompany the video, I really wanted to make it much more of an educational event than simply a kind of like, otherwise we'd just be watching YouTube videos. This is much more, my hope is it's much more, ultimately it's still interactive because of these extras that are being provided.